Hey, Westside. This is part 2 of chapter 1 of Montana 1948. And when we read through the first part of chapter 1, we learned that Marie Little Soldier was sick and that David was taking care of her all day while his mom was at work, and that she did not want to see the doctor in town, Uncle Frank, who was his father's pride and joy, his war hero, his doctor son, as opposed to not his hero, his sheriff son, who was David's father. And now we have Uncle Frank coming in and getting ready to see Marie Little Soldier. And Marie Little Soldier, as sick as she was, kept saying, no, absolutely not. She did not need a doctor. And I'm just going to let you listen to the birds in the trees while I read this, I think. Uncle Frank put his black bag on the kitchen table. How about something to drink, Wes? I was digging post holes this morning and I've been dry all day. My father opened the refrigerator. Post holes? Not exactly the kind of surgery I thought you'd be doing. I'm going to fence off the backyard. We've got two more houses going up out there. Figured a fence might help us keep what little privacy we've got. I wondered what Grandpa Hayden would say about that. Though his land was fenced with barbed wire, as most ranchers were, he still had the 19th century cattleman's open range mentality and hatred of fences. Our backyard, bordered on a railroad track, trains passed at least 4 times a day, but my father refused to put up a fence, as all our neighbors had, separating our property from the tracks. I've got cold beer in here, said my father. It's old man Norgard's brew. Old Norgard lived in a tar paper shack on the edge of town. He had a huge garden and sold vegetables through the summer and early fall. His true specialty, however, and the business he conducted throughout the year, was brewing and selling beer. My father swore by everything Ole Norgard produced. Uncle Frank made a face. I'll pass. My father brought out a bottle with a rubber stopper and a wire holding it in place. You can't buy a better beer. He held out the bottle. Uncle Frank laughed and waved my father away. Just give me a glass of water. My father persisted. Ask Pop, he still drinks Ole Norgard's beer. Okay, Frank said. It's great beer. It's the world's greatest goddamn beer, but I'll drink Schlitz if it's okay with you. My father nodded in my direction. Not in front of the boy. That was one of my father's rules. No one was supposed to swear in front of my mother or me. Uncle Frank picked up his bag. Okay, Wes, I'll tell you what. Let me see the patient first, and then I'll drink a bottle of Ole's beer with you. Maybe I'll drink 2. Just then, my mother came out of Marie's room. She's in here, Frank. Hello, Gail. How is the patient? She's awake. Her temperature might be down a bit. Frank went in and shut the door behind him. Within a minute, we heard Marie shouting, Mrs.! Mrs.! My mother looked quizzically at my father. He shrugged his shoulders. Marie screamed again, No! Mrs.! This time, my mother went to the door and knocked. Frank, is everything okay? My uncle opened the door. She says she wants you in here, Gail. He shook his head in disgust. Come on in, I don't give a damn. This time the door closed and the room remained silent. David, my father said to me, why don't we go out on the porch while the medical profession does its work? Our screened-in porch faced the courthouse across the street. When I was younger, I used to go out there just before 5 o'clock on all but the coldest days to watch for my parents. My father put his bottle of beer down on the table next to the rocking chair. I didn't sit down. I wanted to be able to maneuver myself into the best position to hear anything coming from Marie's room. I didn't have to wait long. I soon heard muffled but unmistakable Marie shout another "No!" I glanced at my father, but he was staring at the courthouse. Then two more no's in quick shouted succession. My father pointed at one of the large elm trees in our front yard. "Look at that," he said. "August, and we've got leaves coming down already." He heard her. I knew he did. Before long, Uncle Frank came out to the porch. He put down his bag and stared around the room as if he had never been there before. "Nice and cool out here," he said, tugging at his white shirt the way men do when their clothes are sticking to them from perspiration. "Maybe I should put up one of these." "Faces east," my father said. "That's the key." "I'll drink that beer now." My father jumped up immediately. Uncle Frank lowered his head and closed his eyes. He pinched the bridge of his nose and worked his fingers back and forth as if he were trying to straighten his nose. I heard the smack of the refrigerator door and the clink of bottles. I wanted my father to hurry. And what had just happened with Marie? I didn't want to be alone with Uncle Frank. Without opening his eyes, Frank asked, "You playing any ball this summer, David?" I was reluctant to answer. My Uncle Frank had been a local baseball star, even playing some semi-pro ball during the summers when he was in college and medical school. I, on the other hand, had been such an inept ball player that I had all but given it up. But since Frank and Gloria had no children, I always felt some pressure to please them, to be like the son they didn't have. I finally said, "I've been doing a lot of fishing." "Catching anything?" "Crappies and bluegill and perch out at the lake. Some trout at the river." "Any size to the trout?" He finally looked up at me. "Not really. 9 inches, maybe a couple 12-inchers. "Well, that's pan size. You'll have to take me out some afternoon." Before I could answer, my father returned, carrying a bottle of beer. "Now drink it slow," he said. "Give it a chance." Frank made a big show of holding the bottle aloft and examining it before drinking. "What was the problem with Marie?" asked my father. "Like you said on the phone, they're used to being treated by the medicine man or some old squaw. But a doctor comes around and they think he's the evil spirit or something." My father shook his head. "They're not going to make it into the 20th century until they give up their superstitions and old ways. I'm not concerned about social progress. I'm worried they're not going to survive measles, mumps, pneumonia, which is what Marie might have. I'd like to get an x-ray, but I don't suppose there's much chance of that." "Pneumonia," said my father. "That sounds serious." "I can't be sure. I'll prescribe something just in case." From where I stood on the porch, I could see into the living room where my mother stood. She was staring toward the porch and standing absolutely still. Her hands were pressed together as they would be in prayer, but she held her hands to her mouth. I looked quickly behind me, since her attitude was exactly like someone who has seen something frightening. Nothing was there but my father and my uncle. "Should she be in the hospital?" asked my father. Frank rephrased the question as if my father had somehow said it wrong. "Should she be? That depends. Would she stay there, or would she sneak out? Would she go home? If she's going to be in some dirty shack out there on the prairie, that's no good. Now, if she were staying right here..." Bent Rock did not have its own hospital. The nearest one was almost 40 miles away in North Dakota. Bent Rock residents usually traveled an extra 20 miles to the hospital in Dixon, Montana. My mother came out onto the porch to answer Frank's questions. Yes, she's staying here. She's staying until she gets better. Her voice was firm, and her arms were crossed, almost as if she expected an argument. Or until she gets worse. You don't want an Indian girl with pneumonia in your house, Gail. As long as she's here, we can keep an eye on her. Frank looked over at my father. If my mother said it, it was so, yet my father's confirmation was still necessary. She can stay here, he said. She's staying here, my mother said one more time. Someone will be here or nearby. I couldn't figure out why my mother seemed so angry. I had always felt she didn't particularly care for Frank, but I had put that down to two reasons. First, he was charming, and my mother was suspicious of charm. She believed its purpose was to conceal some personal deficit or lack of substance. If your character was sound, you didn't need charm. And second, Uncle Frank was a Hayden, and where the Haydens were concerned, my mother always held something back. Yet her comportment toward Frank had always been cordial, if a little reserved. My parents and Frank and Gloria went out together. They met at least once a month to play cards. They saw each other regularly at the ranch at holidays and family gatherings. When either my father or I were hurt or fell ill, we went to see Frank, or he came to see us. My mother, however, went to old Dr. Snow, the other doctor in Bent Rock. She said she would feel funny seeing Frank professionally. Whatever the source of her irritation, Frank must have felt it too. He abruptly put down his half-finished beer and said, I'd better be on my way. I had the feeling I might be called to the Hollands tonight. This is her due date, and she's usually pretty close. I'll phone young Druggan with something for Marie. Give me a call if she gets worse. The three of us watched Frank bound down the walk, his long strides loose yet purposeful. After he got into his old Ford pickup, an affectation that my father made fun of by saying, if a doctor is going to drive an old truck, maybe I should be patrolling the streets on horseback, and drove away. My mother suggested I go outside. I have to talk to your father, she said, in private. If I had gone back in the house to the kitchen, to my room, out the back door, if I had left the porch and followed Frank's steps down the front walk, I would have never heard the conversation between my father and mother, and perhaps I would have lived out my life with an illusion about my family, and perhaps even the human community. Certainly I could not tell this story. I left the porch and turned to the right and went around the corner of the house. From there, I was able to crouch down and double back to the side of the porch, staying below the screen and out of my parents' line of vision. I knew my mother was going to say something about Marie yelling when Uncle Frank was there, and I wanted to hear what she had to say. I didn't have to wait long. My mother cleared her throat, and when she began to speak, her voice was steady and strong, but her pauses were off, as if she had started on the wrong breath. The reason Marie didn't want to be examined by Frank is that your brother has molested Indian girls. My father must have started to leave because I heard the clump of a heavy footstep, and my mother said quickly, No, wait, listen to me, please. Marie said she didn't want to be alone with him. You should have seen her. She was practically hysterical about having me stay in the room. And once Frank left, she told me all of it. He's been doing it for years, Wes. When he examines an Indian, he does things he shouldn't. He takes liberties, indecent liberties. There was a long silence. My mother's hollyhocks and snapdragons grew alongside the house where I was hiding, and the bees that flew in and out of the flowers filled the air with their drone. Then my father spoke. "And you believe her?" "Yes, I do." Footsteps again. Now I knew my father was pacing. "Why would she lie, Wesley?" My father didn't say anything, but I knew what he was thinking. She's an Indian. Why would she tell the truth? "Why, Wes?" "I didn't say she was lying. Maybe she's simply got it wrong. An examination by a doctor. Maybe she doesn't know what's supposed to go on. My gosh, I remember when I had to go see Doc Snow for my school's checkups. He would poke me and tickle me and check my testicles and have me cough, and I might have felt funny about the whole business, but I knew it was part of the exam. But if I didn't know, and it's not like that. Marie told me that's not the case. And if you'd never seen a doctor in your life, why, you wouldn't know what was going on." "No, Wes." "Think if you never had a shot, an injection, if you'd never seen a needle, you'd think he was trying to kill you, to stab you." "Wesley, would you listen to me?" "And Marie, for God's sake, you know how she likes to make up stories. She's been filling David's head with them for years. She's got a great sense of drama, that one." "Wesley!" My mother shouted my father's name exactly the way she would shout at babies, to stop him from doing something dangerous, toddling toward the stairs, extending his finger toward the electrical outlet, anything to stop him. I flinched, and a part of me said, "Leave, get away, run now before it's too late, before you hear something you can't unhear, before everything changes." But I pressed myself closer to the house and hung on. "All right," my father said. "All right, let's have it." There was a shuffling, and I wondered if my mother was moving closer to my father. Her voice became lower. "I told you, when he examines Indian girls, he does things to them." "Things, Gail? He does things to them?" "I'm sure he does things to all his patients." His tone must have angered her, because her voice went right back to where it had been earlier. And though it seemed each word was a product of effort, it also seemed born out of absolute determination. "What things? I'll tell you what things. Your brother makes his patients, some of his patients, undress completely and get into indecent positions. He makes them jump up and down while he watches. He fondles their breast. No, don't you turn away, don't. You asked and I'm going to tell you all of it. He puts things into these girls, inside them, there. His instruments, his fingers. He has, your brother, I believe he has inserted his penis into some of these girls. Wesley, your brother is raping these women, these girls, these Indian girls. He offers his services to the reservation, to the BIA school, to the high school for athletic physicals. Then when he gets these girls where he wants them, I don't even want to say it again. He does what he wants to do." The shock of hearing this about Uncle Frank was double, because my mother was saying these words: rape, breast, penis. These were words I never heard my mother use, never. And I'm sure her stammer was not only from emotion, but from the strain on her vocabulary. I waited for my father to explode, to shout a defense of his brother, to scream a condemnation of Marie and her lies. Instead, he said, as quietly as before, "Why are you telling me this?" "Why?" "That's right, why? Are you telling me this because I'm Frank's brother? Because I'm Your husband because I'm Marie's employer? He paused. Or because I'm the sheriff? I'm telling you, Wes. I'm just telling you. Why? What part of you doesn't want to hear it? I wish, my father said. I wish you wouldn't have told the sheriff. Did he laugh softly, ironically then? I thought I heard a chuckling noise, but it might have been the heavy heads of the snapdragons leaning and rustling against each other. Neither of them spoke for a long time. I wanted to stand up to look at them. Were they embracing, glaring at each other? For some reason, I imagined them staring off in different directions, my father toward the front lawn, and the leaves that fell before they should, and my mother the other way, back into the house, and toward the bedroom where Marie lay, sweating in her fever and her shame. My father asked, Did any of this happen to Marie? Yes, some. Not the worst, but her friends, people she knows. Would she be willing to talk to me? She might be if you approach her the right way. I only have the one way. I know, my mother said. My father clapped his hands, his usual prelude to action. Time to put up the storm windows, to rake the leaves, to shovel the walk, to shake the rugs. To this day, when I hear the first clap of applause in a theater, a lecture hall, a banquet, I reflexively think of my father and his call to chores. Let's see if she's awake, he said, and get on with it. As they left the porch, I ran around the house and went in the back door just as they were heading into Marie's room. Neither of them said a word to me. They went in and closed the door behind them. I lingered nearby but couldn't make out a word, only the steady, low murmur of voices, punctuated occasionally by Marie's coughs. On the kitchen table was Uncle Frank's beer bottle. I examined it closely, searching for lines and whorls of his fingerprints. One of the ways my father kept the respect and admiration of the boys in our town during the war was by fingerprinting every child who stopped by his office. I must have been fingerprinted 15 times myself. I was beginning already to think of Uncle Frank as a criminal. I may not have been entirely convinced of his guilt, but the story my mother told was too lurid, too frightening for me to continue thinking of my uncle in the way I always had. Charming, affable Uncle Frank was gone for good. My parents were in Marie's room for a long time, and when they came out, both of them were grim-faced and silent. How's Marie? I asked my mother. She's going to sleep for a while. That's what she needs now. Our supper was soup and sandwiches, a meal usually reserved for lunches or Sunday evenings when we got home late from spending the day at the ranch. After eating, my father went back out on the porch and simply stood there, staring out at the evening's lengthening shadows. My mother was finishing the dishes when he came back in and announced, I'm going over to talk to Len. Len McAuley was my father's deputy and our next-door neighbor, and before he was my father's deputy, he had been my grandfather's deputy. I once heard a story about how Len, without a weapon, ran down on foot and disarmed a cowboy who shot up a bar on Main Street, but the story was hard to believe about the Len McAuley that I knew. He was tall, gaunt, stoop-shouldered, shy, and soft-spoken. Len and his wife Daisy, who made up for Len's taciturnity with both the quantity and the volume of her talk, were in their 60s, and they were more like grandparents to me than my own. When I was younger, Len used to carve little animals for my play, and Daisy never stopped baking cookies for me. As my father went out the door, my mother called after him, If Daisy's home, tell her I've got a fresh pot of coffee. Moments later, they were off on their own, my father and Len standing in the McAuley front yard and my mother and Daisy sitting at our kitchen table. But there were similarities. All four were drinking coffee. In each pair, one talked while the other listened. My mother and Len were the listeners. And both my father and my mother were, I knew, conducting investigations. I wandered in and out of the house, catching fragments of both conversations until my mother finally said, "David, either go out, or stay in." Daisy laughed and said, "He's like Cuss, her cat. When he's out, he wants to go in. When he's in, he wants to go out." Both my parents were discreet about their investigations. Neither came right out and repeated Marie's story about Uncle Frank, yet they used the same strategy to mention Marie's perturbation and then to pretend mystification. "I don't know why she would act that way," my mother said, while my father shook his head in puzzlement. They both left openings for Len or Daisy to contribute what they could, and my mother struck pay dirt. On one of my passes through the kitchen, Daisy was hunched over the table, her white hair bobbing in my mother's direction, and her tanned, plump arm reaching toward my mother. Daisy's usually loud, brassy voice was lowered, but I heard her say, "The word is, he doesn't do everything on the up and up." Then she noticed me. She straightened up and smiled at me, but stopped talking. That meant I was supposed to leave the room, and I did, but slowly. As I crossed into the living room, Daisy whispered, "Just the squaws, though." Later that night, right before we all went to bed, my mother checked on Marie once more. When she came out, my father and I were in the kitchen drinking milk and eating the rhubarb cake that Daisy had brought over. My mother shut Marie's door quietly, then leaned her back against it almost as if she were using her weight to keep the door closed. She looked tired. She was still wearing her work clothes. She usually changed into dungarees or slacks and a gingham shirt as soon as she got home. Her glasses were off, and her eyes were ringed with fatigue. Her lipstick had faded, and she hadn't brushed out her hair. My father asked without looking up, "How's Marie?" My mother's gaze was fixed upon my father. "You're eating," she said. "Daisy's cake, it's delicious." "You can eat?" At some point, my father must have become aware that she was staring at him. His cake unfinished, he set down his fork. "I don't hear her coughing." "She's sleeping again." I couldn't tell if she was actually looking at him or if she was simply staring off, and his form intersected her vision. Then I knew. She saw him now, as she hadn't before. He was not only her husband, he was a brother, and brother to a man who used his profession to take advantage of women, brother to a pervert. And how did I know these were my mother's thoughts? I knew because they were mine. I put down my glass of milk, but I did not look at my father. I didn't want to notice the way he combed his hair straight back. I didn't want to see that little extra mound of flesh between his eyebrows. I didn't want to see the long line of his nose, the way the long line of his nose was interrupted by a slight inward curve. I didn't want to see any ways that he resembled his brother. "What did Len say?" asked my mother. "That we need rain." My mother hung her head. "That's what we talked about, Gail." She brought her head up quickly. "That's not what Daisy and I talked about." "I don't want this all over town, Gail. We don't have proof of anything." Now they were falling into familiar roles. My father believed in proof, in evidence, and he held off on his own convictions until he had sufficient evidence to support them. My mother, on the other hand, was willing to go on a lot less on her feelings, her faith. My mother said, "It's around town more than you realize." "I don't want this getting back to my father." That was what my father believed in. If he could not sufficiently fear Love, trust, obey, and honor God, as we were told in catechism class we must. It was because he had nothing left for his heavenly Father after declaring absolute fealty to his earthly one. Is that what you're concerned about? Gail, my mother pointed at me. He won't be going to him again, I guarantee that. For God's sake, Gail, he won't. I was afraid I would give myself away by blushing or failing to react the way I should. I wasn't supposed to know what they were talking about. Let's not discuss this in front of him. My mother continued to stare at him. I'll handle this, Gail, in my fashion. After another long silence, my mother finally left her post at Marie's door. She was almost out of the kitchen when she turned and said to my father in the calmest voice she had used all evening, "Just one thing, Wes. You never said you didn't believe it. Why is that? Why?" She waited for his answer. I waited too, breathlessly, looking down at our floor's speckled linoleum and holding my sight on one green speck until my father said, "Of course I don't believe it. Of course it isn't true." But he didn't say a word. He simply picked up his fork and continued to eat Daisy McAuley's rhubarb cake. That was when it came to me. Uncle Frank was my father's brother, and my father knew him as well as any man or woman. And my father knew he was guilty.